And finally this evening, straight after Kent Tonight, we have a brand new episode of Kent Film Club. It's the show where we explore 4 films chosen by our guests and find out exactly what they mean to them. But before we go, I caught up with the show's presenter, Deacy, to find out what's to come, but also what we should be watching this week. So Chris, we're feeling very nostalgic this week with the news that Oasis is getting back together. Now, as I understand, nostalgia is something that you're very familiar with. Has it got you reminiscing?
Do you know, it really has. And I have a confession to make, that back in the 90s, when people would ask that question, are you into Blur or Oasis? I kind of didn't know. But all these decades on, and particularly because I do a radio show where Oasis has appeared many times, and there's that Oasis joke, which actually is very fitting here in terms of the reunion. You know, will their concert sell out, or will people just buy their tickets little by little? But there is something about this, because people were really into Oasis and it mattered to them. And at the end of the day, you've got the 2 brothers, and we see them on the screen here, and of course they fell out. And whether they'll still be on the stage together, because we had that with Frankie Goes to Hollywood and various other artists, where, you know, have it with Ray Davies and his brother from the Kinks as well. So there's something here everybody can sort of identify. Anybody who grew up in the 90s as I did, you know, has that real sort of sense of allegiance. And for them to be reforming again means that we're catapulted back in time.
So we're talking about the 90s here. Does it make you reflect on any classic indie films from that time? Well,
it's funny you ask that, because literally 2 nights ago I saw on the big screen at Cineworld in Dover Pulp Fiction. Now, I saw it when it came out at the end of 1994, so it's literally 30 years since its first release. And while I was sitting there, I just remembered that original experience of watching it and literally turning in my seat almost 180 degrees during a particular scene, which I won't spell out, but it involves a needle. And there was something about that as well, because Tarantino, of course, is a very well-known sort of entity, but at the time he was this real new force. I hadn't seen Reservoir Dogs. So there is something about the 90s for me, because I'm really into 80s music, but whereas Oasis, of course, were really big in the 90s, for me it was film in the 90s, and that's what I'm really nostalgic about.
So music there you mentioned, it plays a big part in your podcast too about nostalgia. When you interview people, do many people talk to you about Oasis and what that genre and era meant to them?
Yeah, completely. Now, Oasis comes up a lot. Blur as well. So there is that sort of sense here that people, it's like a football, I suppose, match in a way of, you know, your tribal loyalties. But Oasis comes up significantly. And of course, in that sense that people often say, because I do a radio show as well on Tuesday afternoons, people are often asking that question, not so much, are you going to play Oasis, but which Oasis track are you going to play? And for a generation before that as well, of course, also from the north of England, you had the Beatles or Jerry and the Pacemakers. So there is that sort of sense of the relationship between place and music, whether you're from Kent or whether you're from the north of England. Then, and of course, interesting that Oasis are going to do their first gig in Cardiff, which is my hometown. So it brings a lot of people together from different communities.
So the buzz will continue, I'm sure, but what films should we be watching out for this week? Have you seen anything that's interesting?
I've seen a really interesting film called Between the Temples, which is a sort of screwball comedy, and it's set in a Jewish synagogue in New York, and it's a very tender film, a bit like Harold and Maude from the 1970s, of very 2 different people from different generations who come together at a time when they're both facing a midlife crisis. I'd thoroughly recommend that. It's a very tender, sort of goofy screwball comedy, but one with a real heart, and has a lot to say about the importance of faith as well.
Sounds really interesting, but really quickly, Chris, what's coming up in Kent Film Club tonight?
Oh, we have Rob Wills, who will be very familiar to audiences and listeners on KMFM from the Drive show that he presents with Numi, and he's got 4 really fantastic films and some real surprises in there, that some of the films that you'd never imagine would go together really well.